Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our distinguished guests, our friends, and our colleagues in Canada and in the ASEAN and other countries. Welcome to our virtual event, The Evolving Economic and Geopolitical Landscape of the Indo-Pacific, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and beyond, organized by the Canada-ASEAN Initiatives at the York Center for Asian Research at York University in Toronto, Canada. My name is Julie Nguyen. I'm the chair of the Canada-ASEAN Initiatives. I turn it over to Julia Bentley, the External Research Associate at the York Center for Asian Research at York University, who will chair this panel.
Thank you, Julie. Good evening, Selamat pagi. As Julie mentioned, my name is Julia Bentley, and I'm serving as chair today in my capacity as an external research associate of York University's Center for Asian Research. I am on leave from Global Affairs Canada, and I'm not speaking in an official capacity today. It's an honor to welcome our audience and our three eminent panelists today, whom I will introduce in slightly more detail in a moment. We have Professor Sufian Jusoh of the University Kebangsaan Malaysia, the National University of Malaysia, or UKM, Dr. Juita Mohamad of Malaysia's Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS, an independent policy think tank, and Professor Paul Evans of the University of British Columbia, or UBC. I'd like to thank the speakers and their institutions, UKM, IDEAS, and UBC, for co-sponsoring this webinar with York University's Center for Asian Research. And thanks to these joint efforts, our audience today includes participants from Canada, Malaysia, Singapore, China, and the US, as well as several embassies in Canada from ASEAN and beyond. As you know, on January 1st this year, RCEP came into force as the world's largest free trade agreement, consisting of the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, China, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. And the CPTPP entered into force just over 3 years ago in December 2018. 9 of the 11 original signatories have ratified the CPTPP, and the last two, including Malaysia, are expected to ratify in due course. Several other countries have applied to or expressed interest in joining the CPTPP. Today's panel offers Malaysian and Canadian perspectives on the drivers and dynamics of this evolving economic and geopolitical landscape. Our speakers will share preliminary assessments of how these multi-layered cooperative arrangements may affect regional prosperity, peace, and stability in the Indo-Pacific. During this 1-hour webinar, the panelists will each give opening remarks for 5 minutes in the first round, followed by a more interactive discussion in the second round, where they can respond to each other's comments for 3 minutes each. And after this, we will field questions for the speakers from our participants, so please take advantage of the Q&A box for that purpose. The two Malaysian speakers who are with us today were valued interlocutors for me during my tenure as Canada's High Commissioner in Malaysia, especially related to Apec and the CPTPP. And I was delighted when they accepted the invitation to participate in today's panel. I've known Paul Evans throughout my career, and it gives me special pleasure to welcome him as our third panelist. The panel has been invited to respond to these questions. In what ways and to what extent are the CPTPP and RCEP reshaping the regional economic landscape at a time when the notion of Indo-Pacific is evolving from a geostrategic term to a geopolitical and geoeconomic reality? How will these trade agreements affect and interact with existing ASEAN-led mechanisms and other regional cooperative platforms? And what do these developments mean for ASEAN, Malaysia, and Canada? Our first speaker is Professor Sufian Jusoh, the director of the Institute of Malaysia and International Studies at UKM in Kuala Lumpur, an international investment policy expert with experience advising governments and international organizations such as the World Bank and UN ESCAP. Dr. Sufian supported the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry during the TPP negotiations 2013 to 2015, and he played a key role in Malaysia's successful chairmanship of Apec 2020, which is how he and I got to know each other. So Dr. Sufian, the floor is yours.
you very much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from Bangi at UKM. I would like to thank Julia for the kind introduction and for inviting me to speak at this important webinar. And then I would also like to thank York for especially the Canada ASEAN initiatives. Dr. Julie Ngunyen for making this happen, and all colleagues, including our newly appointed Port Rafiah Chair, Professor Paul Evans, who is also now associated with ICMAS UKM. Right, I will go straight to the point. This is a very interesting topic, not just for Malaysia, but also for the region, especially in this more challenging environment. Not just COVID. Yesterday, we had a lot of statements from the United States asking ASEAN member states and some of the CPTPP plus RCEP countries to support their new policy towards Russia as a result of the what happened in Ukraine. And it's very interesting to note that most of the parties involved, apart from Ukraine, are related somehow through Apec and also through ASEAN. So CPTPP and RCEP are supposed to be complementary. CPTPP in its original form of TPP was supposed to be the largest trade arrangement in the world. But it didn't happen that way because in 2016, when Donald Trump came to White House, he decided to withdraw. And then we expected Biden to come back because when he was the vice president, he was supportive of Obama's pivot to Asia. But apparently it's not going to happen anytime soon. And then with RCEP, on the other hand, we were looking into some form of complementary, but at the same time, some people were saying it was China-driven. But apparently, people forgot about the fact that RCEP happened when the parties in 2012 decided to launch the negotiation. And RCEP is actually ASEAN-driven. Of course, ASEAN is not very good at public relations, and therefore China has managed to grab the opportunity and try to claim that the baby is theirs. So somehow or other, we have a new form of the largest free trade agreement in the world, which is RCEP. Okay, RCEP is very progressive in the sense that it doesn't impose very high standards, or people are actually taking one step at a time. Say, for example, in the liberalization of services, is negative plus positive. You can choose whether you want to have a positive list or negative list. And in the investment, they can have, they will go through the normal channel of non-conforming measures. On the other hand, the newer ASEAN member states of Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam, they have the opportunity to transpose their liberalization from positive to negative list within 15 years. But I believe Vietnam is already adopting a more pragmatic approach because they are also part of the CPTPP, and they have ratified CPTPP, and they have adopted a higher standard of liberalization in both services and investment by way of negative listing. So when the TPP negotiations started, I was looking forward to the agreement, not so much of the liberalization of standards or liberalization of services and investment and trade, but the CPTPP or TPP was also supposed to be an agent of change. For example, I was looking forward for the government procurement chapter, because that was supposed to increase the level of transparency in government procurement procedures, to increase the level of awareness about the tender and the challenge of decisions, which has not been happening a lot in some of the TPP countries. And then I was also looking forward for the reform of the state-owned enterprises, which are not covered in the RCEP. And from the Malaysian perspective, we have a big issue on both the state-owned enterprises and government procurement because of the Bumiputra policy, and the government has decided at that point of time, they decided to increase the threshold and negotiated extensively throughout the negotiation stage to increase the threshold for both the SOE and government procurement. And then we have other issues like intellectual property, labor standards, and the environment. And now we are facing a lot of issues, not just in Malaysia, but also in some of the ASEAN member states, facing the problem of exporting goods, and especially goods coming from oil palm related activities, and also from glove manufacturers because of the non-compliance with certain labor standards. And I think had it been taken into consideration and implemented, maybe we would not be facing this problem during this most difficult time. So I think another important aspect is CPTPP is going to expand, and we are going to see the United Kingdom coming in, and then China and Taiwan both are already declaring their intention to join the CPTPP, which is basically taken into a bigger context. It's supposed to be part of the Apec FTAP free trade area for the Asia and the Pacific, and we have to wait and see, because the United Kingdom has already been accepted into the negotiation. And this is very important for Malaysia and Brunei, because if the United Kingdom manage to complete the negotiation, which Boris Johnson is very aggressive, then Malaysia and Brunei, who are yet to ratify this agreement, will have to come back on the negotiation table, and will have to negotiate with the UK on the terms of accession. And if China comes before Malaysia ratifying, then Malaysia will also have an issue of having to negotiate with China on the accession. So the problem is, everyone knows that Malaysia is having quite I won't say it's unstable, but a big changes in the government. They are focusing more into the domestic reform, domestic issues like trying to stop party hopping, and also changing the constitution to give more to bring back the power, the status of Sabah and Sarawak as the equal partners of the Federation of Malaya then. So, however, I think, I heard, and I believe that the Malaysian government is working towards ratification. Although Julia said, I said the same thing 2 years ago. Yes, I said the same thing 2 years ago. I will say the same thing today, that they are going to ratify. But the question is when? Because they always say, yes, we are going to do it. During the Barisan Nasional time, they say, yes, we are going to do it. Then the Pakatan Harapan came, then they say, yes, we are going to do it. And then now, Barisan Nasional plus Perikatan Nasional, they say the same thing. Yes, we are going to do it. So I hope they are going to do it this time around. And last point, is quite interesting to also note that from the Malaysian-Canada or ASEAN-Canada perspective, we are moving quite fast on the ASEAN-Canada Free Trade Agreement. ICMAS is personally involved as the coordinator for the early reports and capacity building for electronic commerce, digital economy, and also the trade and services and cost benefit analysis activities. So I think this will be an important element of enhancing Canada and ASEAN economic relation into the future. So that's my very diplomatic early statement. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much for your very diplomatic early statement, and looking forward to whether some of your remarks later might be less diplomatic, but equally interesting. So thank you very much, Dr. Sufian. And turning next to our second speaker, Dr. Juita Mohamad, who is Director of Economics and Trade, as well as Acting Director of Research at IDEAS in Kuala Lumpur. She's an expert in regional integration and the impact of trade liberalization. And she previously worked at Malaysia's Institute of Strategic and International Studies, as well as at the OECD in Paris and the Asian Development Bank Institute. Dr. Juita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julia, for the kind introduction, and thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. So the question that I am supposed to be answering is, how will RCEP and CPTPP affect and interact with the existing ASEAN-led mechanisms and other regional cooperative platforms? And just to emphasize on what Professor said before, RCEP is an ASEAN-led mechanism or framework, and this was further strengthened through my interaction with negotiators from different countries as well. So the short answer to this question would be that both RCEP and CPTPP offer an upgrade in commitment to other existing multilateral and bilateral FTAs. So it could be the ASEAN FTA, it could also be, if you look at the AEC commitments. So since RCEP is already signed and ratified by countries like Malaysia, a small open economy, let us take a closer look at RCEP and also its commitment. So the signing of RCEP is a historic event, especially for Malaysia, making it the world's largest trading bloc by GDP size. And again, RCEP is the second mega trade deal for the region after the signing of the CPTPP, obviously. So again, even as the pandemic remained a sobering reality, the RCEP member countries were pushing towards the again, the signing and also the ratification. So to my surprise, pleasant surprise, after a short wait of around 2 years, RCEP finally came into force in January this year with a minimum of 9 member countries, so 6. 6 from the ASEAN members and 3 from non-ASEAN members. That's the minimum threshold. So as anticipated, given the uncertainty surrounding the spread of the virus and also political instability in some of the countries in the region, the RCEP was finally enforced in January this year. So I do feel that this achievement is significant, not just in GDP size. These 15 countries, it represents around $26 trillion, or about 29% of global GDP. It's even bigger than the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement, and it's even bigger than the EU and also the CPTPP countries combined. So coming back to the question, comparing to other existing ASEAN +1 agreements, RCEP has set a somewhat higher standard. We see that with deeper commitments in the elimination of non-tariff barriers and also the elimination or the drastic decrease of tariff measures. The member countries may reap higher welfare gains in the long term. So studies have shown that the welfare gains of the original RCEP countries, this is with India, for example, will increase between 2020 to 2030. And again, the gains will be varied. This is again on the assumption that non-tariff barriers in services and also in logistics will be cut down by about 20%. So again, RCEP is influential in streamlining the existing FTAs that we have here in the region, and hopefully it will improve the notable effect experienced in the region. We do have a lot of bilateral and multilateral FTAs overlapping with one another with different membership and different commitments. So again, these commitments are known to have increased, have led to the increase of the cost of trade in the region. So again, RCEP may reintroduce efficiency. So again, RCEP will not be able to eliminate all of the complications stemming from existing agreements. However, it can standardize and harmonize disciplines related to rules of origin, for example, dispute settlements, competition, IPR issues, and also e-commerce. So again, these kind of predictability would be very comforting to investors, local and also international investors. So again, when, hopefully when RCEP is in full swing, it will be, very significant, not just regionally, but globally, as it will try to shape the existing interconnectivity of global value chains. Hopefully it will make it, the region a more, it will create a seamless hub where lower trade costs can entice, again, investors and businesses to set up shop in the region. And some studies have shown that without the existing FTAs among the RCEP partners, so again, sorry, I'm trying to reword this. So for those countries without an existing FTA with the current RCEP partners, they will benefit more than those existing partners having had trade relations with other RCEP members. So again, the development gap among member countries also matters. However, RCEP extends also special and differential treatment to lower income ASEAN member countries. And this is very much, again, in line with the ASEAN spirit. And these differential treatment is extended to countries like Cambodia, Laos, and also Myanmar. I will stop here, but I hope we can go into the specific chapters or the specific commitments and compare it between the two, RCEP and CPTPP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juita, for your opening round remarks. And I'd like to turn now to our third speaker, Professor Paul Evans, the HSBC Chair in Asian Research at UBC in Vancouver, a specialist in Asian and Trans-Pacific international relations. He has served as the co-CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada and currently serves as the Canadian representative on the ASEAN Regional Forum's Experts and Eminent Persons Group. And as Dr. Sufian mentioned, Professor Evans was appointed this year as UKM's holder of the Pokrafea visiting chair, and thus he serves as the perfect complement to our two Malaysian speakers. Professor Evans, over to you.
Thank you to Julia and Julie for bringing us together for a rare discussion of Malaysian experts and a Canadian team who should get to know each other better. I think in the era we're facing, Canada and Malaysia may have increasing numbers of commonalities on how, as middle powers, they're going to navigate. We are going to navigate a pretty rocky environment. And I think Dr. Sufian reminding us at the outset that we're meeting today in the context of some very, very distressing developments in Ukraine and on its borders that are going to both reflect the kind of strategic era that we're in, that are going to raise ripples that will run across not just different regions, but the issue areas of politics, security, geopolitics, and trade relations. So it's a turbulent moment. And it reminds me that the discussions we've had involving Malaysians and Canadians on matters of the broader geopolitical context of trade go back some time. I remember in the early 1990s working with Nordin Sopi, with Mohamad Hassan, and with a variety of other key Malaysian thinkers who had one eye on the economic scene and also one eye on the security scene. And it strikes me how different our conversations now are about the strategic landscape than they were in 1990. In 1990, it was the ending of the Cold War. In the year 2022, our era now, we're in the beginning of a new Cold War that has cast a large shadow over political relationships, military relationships, and economy. In 1990, we had a unipolar moment of unchallenged US supremacy. In the year 2022, we have a multipolar distribution with two suns in the sky. In 1990, we had an unchallenged United States brimming with confidence and a China hesitantly entering a regional and global role. Today, a United States lacking confidence and a China perhaps too self-confident and assertive in the region. In 1990, our regional concept, our aspirations, dreams, were around the concept of Asia-Pacific. Today, as is in the title of this session, we are talking Indo-Pacific, and the change in words is significant. Asia-Pacific, as we knew it, was about open regionalism, expansion of inclusive multilateral processes, introduction of ideas of comprehensive, cooperative, and human security, the dream of a community. Free trade area for the Asia-Pacific was a kind of mantra, never quite delivered upon, but it was an optimistic vision of what might be in place. Indo-Pacific, despite the advances in RCEP and the CPTPP, Indo-Pacific has a different frame. It's primarily, at least on the security side, increasingly about arrangements among the like-minded. That idea that there are significant differences, especially with one country, China, that are shaping the activities of many states in the region. It's an era of discussion of strengthened alliances and collective defense arrangements, zero-sum strategic calculations, as compared to that era of cooperative and human security, at least dreaming, that existed in the early 1990s. The mood is so different now. In 1990, there was enormous optimism about an expanded ASEAN and ASEAN leadership, a centrality before based on ideas, influence players in Southeast Asia playing a critical role. The perception now is of internal divisions and recurring questions about ASEAN centrality. The whole issue of what it means now in this context of great power conflict is open for a discussion I hope we can have. Also, 1990, the view of globalization, enthusiasm for globalization, trans-Pacific regional production networks and supply chains. And some of that exists, as we heard in our two colleagues' presentations. But in 2022, at least the discussion on this side of the Pacific has a new emphasis on concepts like reshoring, decoupling, especially in high-tech sectors, as we look at where the fourth industrial revolution and the value added that will be gained from the digital economy. This is not an era of inclusive rulemaking, but one of an era in which nationalism, mercantilism, and techno-nationalism are riding high, including especially in the country next to us, but not alone. And finally, if we compare our two eras, the middle power role. In the early 1990s, it was an era of middle power agency. ASEAN itself was expanding, strengthening. Japan, Canada, Australia, working with ASEAN, were behind the creation of a number of organizations, processes, Apec being one, the ASEAN Regional Forum being another. Fast forward to 2022, and middle powers, we don't focus on their agency as much as on how they are in a squeeze, with pressures to line up behind one of the two sons in their competition, and a whole battery of difficulties that make the middle power role one of responding to pressures rather than great new initiatives. Here I have to single out Dr. Sufian's really bright analysis and a positive analysis about RCEP. But RCEP is not a fully comprehensive process. RCEP doesn't include the United States, just as CPTPP doesn't include the United States or China. So how we navigate through that is an interesting question. And in what I might put out, if I could, Julia, for the discussion today with our colleagues, but an agenda going forward for a Canada-Malaysia discussion. The era of the 1990s, the optimism, some of the ideas about inclusive multilateral institutions, about working with the like-minded and the non-like-minded. ASEAN is still a pillar of strength in keeping those ideas alive. But the institutions that have been created, the ARF, still functioning, still important, the East Asia Summit, but they're being eclipsed by the great power conflict. And in some ways, we're looking at them in a rear view mirror as much as where we might take them. And it's where we might take them that I'd like to give a couple of ideas and how Canada and Malaysia can understand and navigate this new strategic context. Well, there's a lot of bilateral issues between our two countries: trade facilitation, immigration, and refugee questions. We have a lot of things we can work on bilaterally. But the challenge for us is to see if we can find something bigger. And this is going to be complicated. We've heard about some of the internal debates inside Malaysia. Inside Canada, as we are formulating an Indo-Pacific strategy with Canadian characteristics, we don't have a consensus on some key matters, and particularly a China policy. We have some things we know about how to deal with the United States. We don't have a China policy that has a national consensus behind it. What we do know, and we're trying to live with, is how to respond to Chinese pressure and incentives. We've had some pretty serious issues with China in the last 3 years. And the attitudes of Canadians are still fairly negative. Until you have a China policy, you can't frame an Indo-Pacific policy. You can do a variety of things, but it isn't going to have that completeness to it. As we look at the United States, we see domestic polarization, political dysfunction, an America first that is not dramatically different than it was in the Trump era, certainly more open to multilateral and multinational collaborations. But we see America backing away from the inclusive multilateralism of the post-war era, post-World War II era, as it pushes for multinational cooperation with the like-minded, coalitional kinds of activities. Well, over the next year or 2 years, I hope there'll be opportunities for us to have a strategic discussion with our Malaysian and continuing with some other Southeast Asian players. How do we sustain inclusive multilateralism in an era of great power competition and rivalry. We heard about CPTPP membership. Be very interesting how we can, the question of China's membership and the Taiwan issue is a strategic issue more than it is an economic issue. And the kinds of resistance to Chinese involvement in that process before American involvement is going to be very interesting to watch. It's the geopolitical issue of the day. How are we going to keep momentum going on the cooperative and comprehensive security agenda? How are we going to get climate, health, marine resources, the issues that transcend great power rivalries, or at least we wish they did? How do our middle powers, how do we work with Malaysia in moving those forward? And we have to learn how to live with and beyond a fractious America, and how do we live with expanding Chinese presence and influence in each of our societies, but also in international institutions. Where is there common ground and compromise room with China? How and where do we push back? Unilaterally, collectively? How do we promote norms against arbitrary detention and coercive diplomacy? These are matters that I think all of our countries are facing. But to see the challenge for us is to see if we can find some common ground and new areas of understanding involving Canadians perched on the doorstep of America first, and Malaysia on the doorstep of a rising Chinese power.
Thank you very much, Professor Evans. There was a lot of food for thought in the comments of our three speakers, and I'm going to let the three of you have the first opportunity to respond to each other. And I'm going to start with Dr. Sufian to see if there's anything that he has been prompted into commenting on in the remarks of either Dr. Juita or Professor Evans. Dr. Sufian, you have 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I have a very short comment addition to what Paul has mentioned about the situation in Russia and Ukraine and how it could actually cause a spillover effect on the topic that we are discussing today. Because Russia is very much part of Apec, and they have a quite good relation with China at the moment. And with the pressure coming in from the United States to the ASEAN countries to support their sanction against Russia, this probably will create a bit of tension. A bit is an understatement. A bit of tension in this region. So I do not know how the United States is going to play this issue. Are they going to pacify the ASEAN member states and say, look, we are going to be part of you, we are going to come back to the CPTPP, therefore we will enhance trade and investment. But the fact that the United States abandoned us once, and the fact that there are some feeling that they are not coming back at all, and they only come back because they are having trouble and looking for support. I think the ASEAN member states will probably be tilting more towards RCEP than CPTPP at the moment, those who are already in the CPTPP arrangement. So that is the feeling that I have, and I think Malaysia, for a start, will probably be focusing more into the implementation of RCEP, making sure that it becomes a success because it's ASEAN's baby, and we would probably be looking at how CPTPP can actually play catch up with RCEP into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Juita, comments from you?
Coming back to what Paul said about an inclusive agreement, I feel that both RCEP and CPTPP can well, especially RCEP, it can include many more chapters, discipline chapters, to make it more inclusive in the sense that it pushes all of the member countries to have an international standard. So for example, if we were to look at the RCEP, it's quite an upgrade from what we've seen in the existing ASEAN +1, for example, FTAs. But again, it only the provisions are only for trading goods, trading services, and competition and e-commerce. So again, like what Professor said before, we do need RCEP to include provisions on SOEs, for example. We see that in Malaysia, local SMEs are often unable to compete. And this is because there's a lack of leveled playing field, which surrounds the SOEs and, as Prof mentioned, government procurement procedures, which further complicates the issue. So without a chapter on SOE, for example, governments, not just Malaysian governments, but any member country, can award projects based on their mechanisms, their processes, their standards without much transparency. And I do feel that in the future, I really do hope that RCEP will include provisions on labor, for example. I feel that such a chapter would outline provisions to address the rights of workers, both unskilled and also skilled workers, both foreign and local workers here in terms of wages, working conditions, union participation, and also union empowerment. Labor provisions, again, can address various types of issues, including labor exploitation and to a certain extent, human trafficking, and other public policies that would be impacted by labor provisions would include reforms of immigration policies in participating countries as well. And as you mentioned before, Paul, I do agree that there needs to be an environment chapter, a working environment chapter for RCEP, and this has been outlined by the CPTPP. I do feel that with the absence of the environment chapter in RCEP, it may lead to negative or even unintended results, depending on the implementation and governance processes by different member countries. So an environment chapter is urgently needed, given the critical issue of overfishing, overlogging, and illegal wildlife trade in this region. So ASEAN has the opportunity to push for a collective elimination of these unsustainable practices through RCEP, the upgrade of RCEP, and through the ratification of CPTPP. So that's just a bit from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Juita. Professor Evans, for your second round, 2 or 3 minutes of insights before I get to the questions.
Well, let me be very brief, because it's always wonderful speaking with economists. They tend to see the glass half full, what the possibilities are moving ahead. And Dr. Juita's comments about what kinds of things, even ambitions, could be harbored within RCEP are fascinating. And that can indeed be an arena for middle class, middle power initiative and leadership in the absence of an American presence in that organization. I think the limits on both FTA, on both the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and RCEP, without the United States involved, point to a new era. And I'm especially curious on what the view is on the matter of China's admission into CPTPP. We're already seeing arguments around this domestically in several countries, including Australia, where there's certain things they want cleared up in advance. But geostrategically, can we imagine another organization that would move forward on some elements of some parts of the economic agenda without the United States there and China in that organization. I personally make the case, I think we may need to move down that path. Finally, Dr. Sufian's comments about sanctions is a very interesting question, because as we look out in terms of what we are nervous about in dealing with China on matters of arbitrary detention, focused economic attacks, restrictions on particular goods, as happened with Australia. While we see that in play, the question of what we are going to do to think through sanctions as a unilateral weapon as compared to a multilateral one. The United States uses sanctions, and sometimes a variety of countries join with it. But how are we going to deal with the sanctions issue going forward as an instrument of statecraft? I think that's on an agenda. I don't know what organization is going to be able to tackle it. Maybe a United Nations panel. But ASEAN will have some views on this too, having been the victim of American sanctions, unilateral sanctions in past.
Thank you very much. We put even more on the table, and we haven't even had a chance to go to our participants for their questions. So I'm going to turn to that now. And I'm conscious that Dr. Sufian has another pressing commitment, so I'm going to give him the first question, which is, how does the launch of negotiations for the Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement fit into the evolving economic and geopolitical landscape of the Indo-Pacific region? You mentioned that at UKM, you are working on some capacity building for this proposed Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So perhaps you could shed some, share your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Julia. Right, we have a very interesting discussion many years ago. I think, like when you were still the High Commissioner, you came here with the Canada representative, ambassador to ASEAN.
Yes.
Yeah, and Ambassador Kelly, and we had a discussion. I was very optimistic about the ASEAN-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Because Canada and ASEAN, share a lot of similarities. Is a middle power or not so intimidating to ASEAN. Very friendly country. We share similarities in with some of us on federal structure, and the fact that this is a very friendly. Free trade agreement approach. I have on the two issues that we are looking at the moment on digital economy, for example. The digital economy is a big. Canada is big on digital economy, and ASEAN is working towards making digital economy as one of the drivers for the future of ASEAN's member state. And if we look at Indonesia, for example, Indonesia is big on digital economy because of the population, because of the nature of the transactions taking place. They have 2 or 3 unicorns now dealing with this digital trade and digital economy activities. Singapore too, they have 1 or 2 big internet business intermediaries in the form of Grab and Shopee. And Malaysia is trying to build on that by having the digital free trade zone. And then we look at the services. I think we can learn a lot from Canada of how Canada liberalize services and at the same time protecting their defensive interests, especially from the perspective of the US-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement and previously NAFTA. So I'm very optimistic. Apart from the trade issue, I think I'm very optimistic about how we can actually work together with Canada from the political perspective, because we would like to learn how Canada handles its relationship with the United States and other countries in the region, and then how Canada handles its relationship with the European Union, which ASEAN Free Trade Agreement negotiation with European Union has stalled, and then some of the ASEAN member states still at the negotiation stage with the EU. So all this triangular economic and political economy relation between ASEAN, US, ASEAN, Canada, ASEAN, EU, and then we can learn a lot from this side. So Canada can teach us a lot. So I think we are going to have some capacity building exercise from March onwards, led by Canadian experts, and we will look forward to that.
Thank you very much for a very specific answer to that question, and I find that very encouraging. So thank you for that. I have a second question which comes from the Q&A from our audience members. And this question is about the impact of Indo-Pacific developments on Apec, with a specific question about India having sought membership in Apec for a very long time. Will these developments in the Indo-Pacific make a difference? So I see Paul nodding. Do you want to take first stab at that one?
No. I'm nodding because I think it's a very interesting question. We talked Indo-Pacific, I talked US, China, Southeast Asia. I didn't talk India at all. And how India is going to play into the equation. Perhaps our Malaysian colleagues can give us, based on their close interactions with India, whether India is a player of the future, or as in past is, for a variety of reasons, not wanting to get involved with the free trade organizations, whether they were of an Asia-Pacific or an Indo-Pacific design. So I defer to Sufian on this, and before he goes, perhaps he could give us an India update.
I knew it was coming. It's very interesting because India was supposed to be part of ASEAN, and they started the negotiation. They joined the negotiation on the first day, and they withdrew at the last moment on the ground of national interest. We know that they have made some demands at the negotiation table, including access to Mode 4 on services for their IT personnel, and which some of the ASEAN member states are not comfortable. But I think the main reason for their withdrawal was not that. The main reason for their withdrawal was because of their potential conflict or the situation that was escalating at the China-India border, and there was some national, resentment towards having China and China's products into India. If you go to Delhi or some of the Indian big cities, it's very difficult to find Chinese restaurants in India. So I think it's more about their political rather than economics reason. Are they going to join Apec? It's going to be difficult because yes, they are closer to Apec, closer to ASEAN, closer to every one of us, compared to the UK. And the UK is already part of the CPTPP, which is an Apec creature. It's part of the Apec FTAP initiative. But then I don't see that is coming very soon because of the potential issue with China. And there's always an argument that India is not bordering the Pacific Ocean, which is like why you have the UK when India is closer to us. So I leave that to your imagination. Thank you.
Perhaps I'm going to ask one more question, and this one will probably be Dr. Juita best placed to respond. And that has to do with the appeal of the CPTPP as an incentive to Malaysia to restructure the economy, institute policy reform, and improve its economic competitiveness. And I'm watching the clock. We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to answer that one quickly, if you can.
Okay, so I do feel that CPTPP can be a vehicle for reforms in Malaysia, especially when we're trying to be a high middle income country backed with skilled workers and backed with the growth of the digital economy and also digital trade. So I do feel that on that pathway, CPTPP would fit in very well with our vision and our status or our aim to become a high income country and also a developed country in the next 5 years or so. But again, to do this, the Malaysian government would need to look at the commitments made within the CPTPP itself on labor standards. I do understand that some of the ILO conventions have been ratified by Malaysia, and there are some that are left outstanding. The environment chapter, the SOE chapter, and also the government procurement chapter, as well the ISDS chapters would be very beneficial for Malaysia as it becomes or aims to become a major trading partner, not just in the region, but at a global scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to move to the final comments because I know Dr. Sufian needs to go. So I'm going to give him the first chance to say, you have something else you'd like to add as we wrap up today's discussion?
I look forward to the ASEAN-Canada FTA, but I'm very worried about what is going on in the north of the world because it will definitely have a major impact on energy, on trade, on investment, on the way we deal with things that we are facing at the moment. So I hope the Indo-Pacific region will be more pragmatic in its approach and not, they have to think a lot more before making any decision on unilateral sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Juita, final comment?
I do hope that the CPTPP will be ratified by the outstanding partners, especially for Malaysia. And I do feel that with countries like Canada being able to also show Malaysia that there is nothing to be afraid of. Reforms are good. It doesn't impede national sovereignty issues. So I do feel that we need to work closely to show that CPTPP is all good and it can be beneficial for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Evans, your final comment?
Just to say how much it's been a valuable opening to the discussion, that the economic agenda, the trade policy agenda is important in its own right. And it can be one of the things we perhaps can make some progress in. But the overwhelming shadow of what is happening geopolitically now is of great concern. And how we can maybe find some ways to understand and live with our two suns in the sky, with the United States and with China. ASEAN has often shown a resilience and a intelligence in avoiding binaries, yes or no, one kind of security order or another. And as we in Canada try to wrestle with this idea of Indo-Pacific, which to many of us, Indo-Pacific is about a conception of international politics that is very different than the Asia-Pacific one. ASEAN has tried to come up with a way to hedge both sides, and maybe we're going to have to learn how to adopt that and further it. Canadians need some teaching too, Sufian. So we will be willing to swap tutorial services on some issues, on the grounds that it is a mutual exchange with two sets of teachers.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very encouraged by the optimism I've heard, and this has been a very impressive conclusion for the panel's discussion. And I think this is just a beginning. We've had lots of ideas on where Canada and Malaysia can go, and also what we might expect in this evolving landscape of the Indo-Pacific. And so I would like to thank all of the participants who have been with us this evening, and our speakers, Dr. Juita, Professor Sufian, Professor Evans, for joining the discussion and sharing your insights on this evolving landscape of many acronyms. And on behalf of York University's Center for Asian Research and its Canada-ASEAN initiatives, I'd like to thank the respective home institutions, UKM, IDEAS, and UBC, for co-sponsoring the webinar, and all of the participants who have participated from across the Indo-Pacific. I hope you found the discussion as stimulating as I have. And Julie and I look forward to welcoming you to future events of the Canada, ASEAN, and Indo-Pacific series at York University. The next event is a webinar on April 5th on regional connectivity building in Southeast Asia, featuring Professor Cheng Tri Kwik of University Kebangsaan Malaysia, Professor Lynette Ong of University of Toronto, and Professor Amitav Acharya of American University in Washington, DC. Thank you very much for participating this evening, or this morning, on the other side of the Indo-Pacific, and see you next time. Jumpa lagi.